Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we welcome a man who comes to us bearing many titles. He's a man who's won a National Book Award for his very first book called The House of Morgan. He's a man who wrote a biography of John D. Rockefeller entitled Titan, and that was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award, and remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 16 weeks. But none of that old stuff. Today, the man is here to talk about his new book. His name is Ron Chernow. His book is Alexander Hamilton, and it's published by the Penguin Press. Welcome aboard.
Pleasure to be here, Jim.
I need to start this with some nice words that were written about this book in a place called the New York Times Book Review, and some really startling things. At least they were startling to me. The reviewer talks about Hamilton being the most neglected of the Founding Fathers, and he submits that this is because, first of all, he was a relentless climber, and nobody has unalloyed views about ambition. Second, he was a great champion of commerce, and nobody has uncomplicated views about that subject either. And third, because his most bitter rivals, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, outlived him by decades and did everything they could to bury his reputation. Poor fellow. So there is no Hamilton monument in Washington, but at least we now have Ron Chernow's moving and masterly Alexander Hamilton, which is by far the best biography ever written about the man. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'll accept that review.
Yeah. He goes on to say that nobody has captured Hamilton himself as fully and as beautifully as Chernow has done the job. Now, one of the things that sets Hamilton apart, I think, is that from the other Founding Fathers, other than the things the reviewer mentioned, was that he comes from a completely different place from the rest of them.
That's right. All the rest are growing up, pampered on Virginia plantations or living in neat New England villages. And here's this kid from the Caribbean. He's orphaned. He's illegitimate. By the age of 14, he's toiling away as a clerk in a trading house to make a living. He has everything against him. And you're right, Jim. I mean, he's the only foreign-born Founding Father.
And he's a bastard, too, which, is not important in one sense, but in a sense, I think that he never was able to shake his roots.
You're absolutely right.
And I think that was one of the things that really got to him.
Yeah, because here's a guy who's, brilliant to the point of genius. He seems self-assured to the point of cockiness. And yet he's hypersensitive about anything dealing with his childhood and his background. And it makes him combative. There's always this chink in his armor, this sensitive spot. And if you poke it, he tends to go berserk.
Yeah, no, he doesn't respond calmly to anything,
No.
and particularly to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, he would respond like with, a string of 25 consecutive essays. His was not a light touch.
No,
it was a powerful touch, but not a light touch.
You use the word most properly here about him. You use the word prolix.
He's prolix.
And boy, is he prolix.
Well, I mean, his collected papers. This is someone who was dead by age 49. His collected papers run to 22,000 pages. He was just a human word machine. He could talk for hours on end in perfectly formed paragraphs. He was somebody who, for Washington, could toss off a 10,000 word memo overnight. Yeah.
That's amazing. The other thing amazing about him, I think, is that he was doing so many things when most of us are worried about acne. Really.
Yeah, some people have commented, and I think it's true, that people seem to have been fully formed at an earlier age in those days. In fact, most people entered college. Of course, most people didn't go to college, but those who did entered college at 15. A lot of the prominent people from the Revolutionary era, Governor Morris, Aaron Burr, entered college at age 13. So there's a sense of life being speeded up. But by age 22, he's Washington's aide-de-camp, virtually Washington's chief of staff. So everything seems to be happening in this kind of speeded up fashion with Hamilton.
And at age 15, he was outlining a strategy to fight the British.
Well, it's amazing. Yeah, when he was an undergraduate at King's, later renamed Columbia, when the name King's became a bit inconvenient after the Revolution.
Oh, the gem of the ocean.
Yeah, he was saying as an undergraduate, we should kind of fight this very scrappy, mobile sort of war. Don't engage the British in open, pitched battles, war of attrition. He foresaw it all.
Yeah, because they had horses, they had more cannon and so forth, and the way to fight them was guerrilla.
Yeah, and basically Washington's strategy was to outlast the British.
You know, our idealized notion of the Founding Fathers is one of great men always working in harmony. How wrong a notion this is when we return.
Find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Spreaker. Jim Foster, Conversations on the Coast. We're also on Twitter at Jim Foster, COC.
This is Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster, and we are in the second segment of our first program with Ron Chernow, talking about his new biography, Alexander Hamilton. A biography about which another well-known biographer, Robert Caro, has this to say: a brilliant historian has done it again. The thoroughness and integrity of Ron Chernow's research shines forth on every page of his Alexander Hamilton. He has created a vivid and compelling portrait of a remarkable man, and at the same time, he has made a monumental contribution to our understanding of the beginnings of the American Republic. And I think one of the things that your Alexander Hamilton helps us to understand is that the beginnings of the American Republic were marked by many disagreements, many arguments, many feuds. And, you know, for example, an event that we learn in our superficial, I suppose you should call them, history courses, we learn about the Boston Tea Party. What a totally wonderful event that was, how it started us on the right track to freedom. Nay, not so. You had Tories in New York who weren't so happy about the Boston Tea Party.
Oh, yeah. You know, after the war, I think Hamilton, John Adams, and others, had estimated that maybe a third of the population was patriotic, maybe a third of the population was Tory, a third was trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing and wanted to come out on the right side. New York was really one of the bastions of the Tories, and so it's interesting that Hamilton is in college there, and he's writing these polemical pamphlets and he's giving these rabble-rousing speeches against the British, but in a town where there was a lot of sympathy for the crown.
As things develop, the war is over, and the Founding Fathers are attempting to shape the new state. There comes an incredibly important dispute, and one that rages on even to this day. The views of the powers of Congress and the head of state. They're widely divergent. States' rights versus having a strong federal government. Yeah. That became a real feud, and it goes on.
Yeah, and there was also a feud in terms of, even if you accepted federal power, which house was going to be dominant? Was the executive branch, the president, going to set the agenda, or was Congress going to set the agenda? You know, that there was a lot of glorification of Congress because that was the popular body, and Jefferson and Madison really thought that was going to be the engine of government. That was the perfect expression of the popular will. Hamilton, I think, was more realistic and certainly more prophetic in saying the branch of government that's the engine that's going to set the whole thing in motion is the executive branch, is the presidency. There's no question that he was right that only the president, with the support of the Senate, could carry on foreign policy, that the U.S. Congress is not the ideal vehicle for having any kind of consistency.
You got that right.
Foreign policy. Yeah.
You got that right.
Yeah.
Jefferson also envisioned a country that would remain, I don't know whether the word is true, but let me say that, true to its agrarian roots.
Right, yeah.
And somehow develop that way, whereas Hamilton saw a country of industry, of banking, of trade.
Yeah, Hamilton realized that agriculture for a long time into the future would be important, but he wanted to diversify that with trade, commerce, banks, stock exchanges, corporations, manufacturing. In other words, a world that looks very much like the economic landscape of today. But Jefferson, Madison, Adams considered a lot of these activities, particularly banking and financial activities, as really evil activities. And so Hamilton develops a somewhat satanic image, but it really is coming from people who believe that there's something intrinsically evil about a lot of the economic and financial activities that he's
in a capsule
yeah.
phrase, you say someplace that Jefferson thought that the major threat to liberty sprang from too much government, while Hamilton thought that only government could safeguard liberty.
Basic,
and you can't get much different than that.
Absolutely.
And then there comes, Jefferson supports Adams for president because it kept Hamilton out. Now, this really gets to be a nasty feud after a while.
Yeah. No, and in fact, then during the famous tie election of 1800, when Jefferson ties Aaron Burr, Hamilton, who had made a career of these diatribes against Thomas Jefferson, suddenly decides that Aaron Burr is even worse than Thomas Jefferson, and so he starts lobbying for Thomas Jefferson. The intrigue was very intricate here.
We're going to talk later on about how Mr. Hamilton is contemporary in a number of ways. I hadn't thought about that one. You're so opposed. Now I find a worse villain, and I'm more opposed to him than I am to you.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yes, exactly.
Therefore, I will find a way to support you, even though I can't stand your guts. Clearly, Alexander Hamilton is a complex man, hard to understand fully. When we come back, there are two things in his life that to me appear unexplainable at all.
Find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Spreaker. Jim Foster, Conversations on the Coast. We're also on Twitter at Jim Foster COC.
This is Jim Foster. This is Conversations on the Coast, concluding its first program with Ron Chernow talking about his new marvelous biography, Alexander Hamilton. We in the first segment, we quoted dutifully from the New York Times Book Review, which said that your book of Hamilton's the best thing since sliced bread. And in last week's New York Times, in a little column next to the bestseller list, they added a few more remarks, which I'd like to share with our audience. Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, Penguin Press, gives the price $35. Everyone knows how Hamilton died, but who can truly recall his pre-Weehawken years? Parentheses. If you can't, you are encouraged to blame Jefferson and Adams, who energetically swept their rival into the dustbin of history. Hamilton wrote a treatise on the proper bathing of children. For one thing, he created American capitalism for another. So I guess don't miss the book. The guy is important.
Well, I've taken him, I hope, out of the dustbin of history, dusted him off a little, buffed up the image.
Makes you sneeze when you think of him, doesn't it? Coming out of the dustbin. Oh, well, any mention is good, particularly next to the bestseller list, because even people who don't read the bestseller list.
You'll hear no words of protest from me, Jim.
I do want to talk about things in his life that I find unexplainable. One of them is, we mentioned early on that at a very young age, he was the chief of staff for General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. Yeah. And this is a position from whence he took a walk at a certain point. And a guy with his ambitions where else would he want to be?
Yeah, I mean,
it takes a walk.
Like 5 years before, he was toiling away as a clerk in this trading house in the Caribbean, and now he's chafing that he's chained to his desk with George Washington. Anyone else his age would have been thrilled to be where he was. But he dreamed of battlefield glory. This had been a fantasy of his since childhood, that unlike a lot of intellectuals, Hamilton was really a daredevil who courted danger. But I'll tell you, in retrospect, I think that one thing that he got right, he was very ambitious, and he realized that then as now to be a battlefield hero would go much further politically than to say in after years, I wrote the best letters for George Washington of anyone on his staff, which doesn't have quite as romantic a ring.
No, it doesn't. And of course, when he got in the trenches, he was his usual wild and woolly self.
Yeah, I mean, he was the first to storm the ramparts at Yorktown, because he was only around 5'6", 5'7" when they got to the outer wall. He had one of his subordinates kneel in front of him so that he could spring up on he stepped on his shoulder and then sprang up on the on the parapet. So this was really a guy who was fearless. Say what you will.
Thanks for the step up, old boy. Another thing that I find hard to explain, in a way, is his affair with Maria Reynolds. Mm-hmm. But perhaps even harder to explain than the affair is the 95-page pamphlet he published detailing what went on.
Okay, I have to explain this, because at the height of his powers as Treasury Secretary, for a year, Hamilton has an affair with Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds surfaces out of nowhere and begins to blackmail him. Hamilton pays blackmail money. What happens 5 years later, when this affair is exposed in the press, and it's exposed that he had been paying money to Mr. Reynolds. Mm-hmm. Reynolds was saying that Hamilton had paid the money because they were secretly conniving and dabbling in Treasury securities. Hamilton said, no. I was paying Mr. Reynolds the money for the honor of having adulterous affair with his wife. So he felt that people wouldn't believe him unless he piled on the details. I don't think, Jim, that he needed to pile on 95 pages of details. I think a couple of paragraphs
I
would
think
have
you
done
put it quite well. About 4 or 5 paragraphs would have done the job.
Yeah.
Didn't need
prolix.
Another thing that I don't know whether the word is unexplainable, but was very interesting was that his death by dueling was foreshadowed by his son dying in the same way.
With the same pistols 2.5 years before. Wow. And his son got involved in the duel because another young man was insulting his father. So you get this strange situation. He goes out to the dueling ground at Weehawken, and because his own son had died at age 19 in a duel 2.5 years before, Hamilton has a principled opposition to dueling, but he feels he can't duck the duel without looking like a coward. So he develops a strategy that was actually used by other people at the time, wasting your shot. He would go, he would, if necessary, take a bullet. He hoped not a fatal bullet, but he himself would fire in the air. It's very hard for us to think ourselves back into this kind of convoluted code of honor, but it was all very real to him.
And it was, at the time, a way of settling disputes.
Yeah, and actually I should say that most duels were affairs of honor that did not end up on the dueling ground. And a good analogy today would be someone sends you a letter accusing you of libel. You get a lawyer's letter, and most of them are settled
out of court.
Yeah.
We've been talking with Ron Chernow about Alexander Hamilton. The good news is he's coming back next week for another session on Conversations on the Coast. And I'm your host, Jim Foster.
Find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Spreaker. Jim Foster, Conversations on the Coast. We're also on Twitter at Jim Foster, COC.